Good afternoon. My name is Nick Buron. I'm the Chief Librarian for the Queens Public Library, and it is an honor to be here with you all for this program.
Hi, my name is Sara Dallas, and I'm the Director of the Southern Adirondack Library System. And thank you for deciding to come to this program at this time slot. As Becky said, please feel free to comment in the chat box or raise your hand to ask questions. And if we were in Saratoga Springs, Nick and I would start our presentation and saying, to understand who's sitting in the room with us, we'd like to know how many people are library administrators. So if you could just take a second.
We're going to try to do this virtually, so please work with us.
Looks like we have a couple popping up at the top.
That's good to know.
Excellent. Thank you.
And how many of you are library workers, non-administration?
Looks like we have a lot more of those.
Excellent. I'm very excited that you all have joined us. And the final one is, how many of you are library trustees?
It looks like in Goldilocks terms, that one is just in the middle.
Just right.
Just right.
Good, because we presented a program that is geared to all three groups. Good planning, Nick. Okay, now I'm going to ask another question. The first is, I want to share with you, intellectual freedom can exist only when two essential conditions are met. One, all individuals have the right to hold any belief on any subject and to convey their ideas in any form they deem appropriate. All those who agree, raise your hand. Oh, I see people raising hands. How cool is this?
That was a real person.
Fabulous. Fabulous.
We also have Sarah in the chat on Feedloop. People are just saying, raise hand, agree, and little raising hand emojis.
Excellent. Excellent.
Fabulous. That's so good to hear. Lovely. And then the second question, or the statement I'm going to make, is society makes an equal commitment to the right of unrestricted access to information and ideas, regardless of the communication medium used, the content of work, and the viewpoints of both the author and the receiver of information. Those who agree, let's do that again. There's a comment
I think it would
that
be work for you, but there's work for all of you, it seems.
somebody made a great point about deem appropriate is a difficulty. Fabulous. And those that disagree. Fabulous. And appropriate is a key word. Thank you, everyone. And following those two tenets is especially difficult now, given the political given the political divisions and social justice issues facing us. In our world, ethical dilemmas occur when values are conflicting. As library workers, we significantly influence or control the selection, organization, preservation, and dissemination of information, and that's challenging. In a political system grounded in informed citizenry, we are members of a profession explicitly committed to intellectual freedom and the freedom of access to information. We must ensure the free flow of information and ideas to present and have available for future generations. Nick and I are going to be talking about some things and we might not have the answers, but we want to bring it up so we can think about it and work towards it and work towards understanding. We're going to share two stories taken from the headlines. I hope that's not a copyright infringement, but I'm not playing the music, so I think we're okay. Scenario number one. Do you remember the national discussion that went viral about the Douglas County Library in Nevada in around July 2020? The library director, Amy Dotson, added an agenda item to the July board meeting packet. The agenda item was possible diversity statement for discussion. The diversity statement will be reviewed by the board during the board meeting. Remember that? The Douglas County Sheriff, Dan Coverly, sent an open letter to the library's Board of Trustees before the meeting. The letter threatened that the police would no longer respond to the library's 911 calls due to the proposed support of Black Lives Matter in a meeting board agenda packet. Is it sounding more familiar? The library director and the sheriff began talking, and the sheriff recanted his statement, and he said he would respond to 911 calls.
Be fairly brief. This one ends at 4.
Oh, okay, I will. The library director and the sheriff began talking, and the sheriff recanted his statement and that he would respond to 911 calls. And the library director made it clear that they respected the difficult work done by the sheriff's department. In a press release, the sheriff's office said they would continue to respond to all 911 calls, including those at the library. He said his response to the library's proposed agenda item was to provide public comment about their proposed diversity statement and to provide further open commentary about how this could affect our local law enforcement profession. The Board of Trustees had earlier stated before the shutdown and pandemic and all of the social unrest we witnessed, that they needed to develop a diversity statement, and it should be one of their goals, and that they would work on it. The library director stated, though, when all of the events across the country and having been inspired by other libraries to make a statement, we were following suit. We were doing what the profession expects us to do. Okay, so who are the key players in this scenario? There's the library director and staff, the library board of trustees, the sheriff and the sheriff's office, and the community. Outcomes and updates. You might not be aware of this. The Douglas County Board of Trustees authorized, are you sitting, a $30,000 investigation into library director Amy Dotson following a meeting agenda item. Dotson proposed the board finally support the Black Lives Matter was the reason for the investigation. Douglas County has appeared in national headlines regarding the ire of the sheriff over the proposed statement of support. As subsequent protest rallies happened in the community, both supporting Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter counter protest. That gave even more attention to the issue. And there were reports that there were alleged assaults taking place during the rally. There have been no arrests now. More troublesome was that due to the pandemic, the library budget was cut 22%, and the book budget was slashed by 75% alone. And just to let you know, the $33,000 fee will be taken out of the book budget. A statement for more access inclusion in reality led to less access and less resources for the community. So moving forward, what can happen? What should happen? Libraries engaged in ridding libraries of racism and policies that reflect racism either implicitly or explicitly, and ensure that everyone receives fair treatment and equal access to the library. The public library is a place for different political stances and sees it as a library's mission and goal to be welcoming and inclusive. This is a fabulous opportunity to have community conversations around these types of issues, an opportunity to engage in conversation among the sheriff's office, the library, the community, to understand everyone's fears, civic truths, and develop better civic goals. It is an opportunity for public library training of trustees to understand their responsibilities and improve the way library staff and trustees communicate and how people communicate, or how the library communicates to the public. Nick.
Thank you, Sarah. So that's a great example of, and first of all, I want to say it's very difficult to try to use neutral words in order to describe this without taking a side, one way or the other too. But, this is an example of really needing to have, a good communication with your board, with your public, with your staff, with your community before something actually happens in your community. When you take a stand sort of on your own, you're sort of out there. And oftentimes when you're dealing with intellectual freedom issues and everyone agrees with you, it's never going to be a problem. However, if you live by intellectual freedom, and even if you get everyone on board beforehand and then the issue comes up, it still might be messy and it still might even feel a little yucky, even when you're doing the right thing. And so I have two scenarios, one outside of my library, and then I'll even share one inside my library as well. So many libraries have meeting rooms, and many libraries allow outside groups to use their meeting rooms, and some libraries even rent out the space. It is, and I might say this a couple of times, it is imperative to have good policies in advance before something goes down. So if you don't have a meeting room policy and then you try to have groups use your meeting room, you're liable to be subjective in who you give the meeting room to, especially if it's easy to give the meeting room to one group, but then might seem a little controversial to give it to another group. The lawyers will have a field day with you, and it will cost your library lots of money. So it is worth it to make sure that you have a strong fundamental meeting room policy. I'm not going to share the whole thing, but I'm sure many of you have a policy. You might draw up a policy and think it looks great. I strongly suggest that you please run it by the lawyers, because they're the ones that are going to find holes in it, and they're going to find that if you don't implement it correctly, you're going to be in big trouble. And it's going to be more than yucky. It's going to be detrimental on many levels to your library. So many libraries have programs that in their meeting rooms that some people don't really appreciate. Some culture groups that use the library, and then everyone says, well, you don't have my culture in there. I think your drag queen story hour that you have, is fundamentally wrong, and you shouldn't have it either. And so given the nature of the society we're in and the way our country is very divided, it seems that you're never going to make everyone happy. Don't try. Don't try to make everyone happy. However, have a fundamental core of which you can base any decision that you move forward on. And this actually worked really well in this example. The example is, if you remember back, earlier this year, before all this, the Seattle Public Library had a program on February 1st, which seems years ago, but they had a program on February 1st where one group was booked their meeting room, and it followed the board's approved policy. The group's event was titled Fighting the New Misogyny, a Feminist Critique of Gender Identity. And it was publicized as, quote, a critical analysis of gender identity that will, quote, make powerful arguments for sex-based women's rights. So I know that some of you are thinking, I remember that, and I had an opinion on that too, one way or another. And that's okay to have an opinion. Who can't have an opinion is your library system. And so the program placed the library in a very difficult position. How can the library maintain its commitment to evolving intellectual freedom ideas, providing access to information for the entire community, and be an inclusive space where all patrons feel safe and welcome? So the group sponsoring the event was the Women's Liberation Front, and it was booked as a women's rights talk. They are self-described as, quote, a radical feminist organization that has publicly espoused what critics have called anti-trans views. So the library, made this decision with their chief librarian and their board of trustees. They understood in booking this that there were going to be people in the community that were going to object. And they were ahead of this. So their board of trustees actually issued a statement that said the library must maintain its role as a stalwart protector of intellectual freedom for all, ensuring that all voices can be heard in a public forum by those who wish to hear them. Now, clearly, there were some people in the community and some staff that were adamantly opposed to to this decision. And so there was a community backlash, especially among some community members, including transgender local and trans allies. And there was a whole brouhaha that developed, but the library kept its strong foundation. It had a strong meeting room. It had a strong public conduct policy, which is also imperative to have as well, public conduct policy. And they went ahead, but they also did what was important to do at that time. The library director, the chief librarian Turner, had said that, quote, controversial groups like this can test our limits as democratic centers of free speech and intellectual freedom, as well as our limits as a united community and organization. So what they did was they used it as an opportunity to reach out to those members of the community that felt disenfranchised by the library's decision. And so in order to maintain that intellectual freedom and to stay true to their meeting room policy, they used it as an opportunity to reach out to other groups. Were they successful? Well, I guess that depends on which side of the issue that you might be on and how you're feeling. And the thing is, like I said earlier, you're not going to get everyone that's going to say the library did perfect. In fact, when Library Journal gave them their award for Library of the Year this past year, I think they actually insinuated that it was in spite of these decisions, which, as opposed to because of these decisions. However, one of the things that they pointed to is that how well the library handled this before, during, and after the event to try to get as many voices heard. Were there enough voices heard? Again, that's going to be, depending on where you are. My example was we have an exhibit space in some of our libraries. And we have a very large Asian population and a very large Chinese population here in Queens. And we try very much to showcase the cultures of the people in Queens, of which there are many, 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 many. And in highlighting, it's part of an exhibit. The library had a mutual a memorandum of understanding with a group that was going to showcase art and photographs, and it was very nice. And they had a very nice exhibit. It was non-controversial. And then they had another one, not very controversial, but their third one, of which they were all along known to us. They were getting, some funding from the consulate of China, of which we work with many consulates, just like many organizations and ethnic groups work with their home consulates. And, once the exhibit on photographs of Tibet came out, that caused a stir among the Tibetan community. It seemed that the Tibetan community very much objected to this exhibit showing smiling faces, all the great things happening in Tibet. And the Tibetan community said, that is not what's going on. This is not representative of what our community believes, and you should take that down. And quite honestly, as I'll be full disclosure, for rights for Tibetan people in China is something that I myself have really, marched for, have really believed in for a long time. And I did not feel very good, having to defend the library, even though we were correct that this was done because we were on our strong ground beforehand. What did we do? We reached out to the Tibetan community and we said, listen, we need to present your issues as well. Let's use this as an opportunity to bring in Tibetan culture and showcase that. And, quite honestly, what ended up happening is that, it was not really what they were looking to do. They wanted us to get rid of it. They protested outside the library, which again, a wonderful First Amendment thing to do is to protest outside and make your voice known. And in the end, it was the sponsor of the event, of the photo exhibit, that actually wanted to take it down. It no longer, was something that was meeting, what they were looking to do. And so they took it down and we acquiesced to that. That still didn't mean that we weren't gonna, reach out to the Tibetan community and really try to also do that. And then the pandemic took hold, and that is something that we need to follow up on, as we have. But the thing is, in a case where you're still relying on really good meeting room policies, exhibit policies, there are going to be times that you're going to defend something that, as an individual was not going to make you feel good. But you have to fall back on your professional beliefs and on what we stand for as a library, and knowing that you have good policies to have a firm basis on. So if you are not prepared for that, you shouldn't have any exhibits. You shouldn't have anyone use your meeting room except for you. And that is okay too, okay? Because there are some libraries cannot afford a major lawsuit without shutting down. And so if you cannot do that, it is imperative to make sure that you are able to live to the standards that you need to set. Because offensive speech and hate speech are protected by the First Amendment, unless it's harassing or it's a threat. And, along with the meeting room policy, I had mentioned that you need a code of conduct, and you have to address that in your meeting room policy. So if anyone does that, they have to abide by your meeting room, by your code of conduct. So, that is very important that clearly no one can harass anybody in the library, nor can they harass anyone in your program. It is an ethical dilemma following the law, or limiting the room's use because of hate speech threatens patrons and library staff and physical safety, and that is unacceptable. But it still doesn't mean it's not going to feel good. But if the library, like the Seattle Public, decided not to hold their meeting, the library would have faced a lawsuit and spent public funds on court. And they would have lost, and they would have need to pay court fees, and the group suing them as well. The courts have held that publicly funded libraries are designated as limited form or limited forms for the receipt of information. And so we have a responsibility. Library administration must make sure that the staff feels supported. That means before anything happens, you need to have a good relationship with your staff, with your board, with your community. Because if you don't, you will not, if you don't have friends before something comes up, you're definitely not going to have friends afterwards. You will be out in the cold. And that is a bad place to be for your library, let alone for yourself. So it's important to carefully look at board-approved policies, look at the language. How are they written? Is the policy language subjective, or is it overly general? Publishing the policies are very important too, to put them on your website and let the community see what you stand for. Get respect. You are not always going to be liked. People will disagree when you have drag queen story hour, okay? But if they see that you are fair, then they don't have to like it, they need to respect it. Policies must be applied consistently, and this has to be an opportunity to have a community conversation around these issues. Again, around the issues, not the issue at hand when everyone gets riled up about something very specific. It is promotion of diversity, and diversity training among library staff and volunteers is absolutely necessary to have people think that there are going to be things that I don't agree with that are going to be presented. It's an opportunity for public library staff and the public library for training of trustees to understand what their responsibilities are. If they are library trustees, they also have to uphold what the library stands for and intellectual freedom. And again, if you're not prepared, don't do it, okay? And that's okay to tell your community, listen, we haven't figured this out in a fair way for all. We're working on it. Until that time, it is only going to be programs that we have for our community that we're going to have, okay? And we're not going to bring in outside groups. So, lesson to be learned is to have allies and friends and staff and community and the board understand what you stand for before you actually have to stand firmly on the side of an issue. Sarah?
We're going to ask some more questions than have answers, but I wanted to share some of the things that at least go through my brain. A few years ago, I would have said that libraries were neutral community partners. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Somebody said libraries could be political, but not neutral. I'll get into that a little bit later. Can intellectual freedom and social justice really coexist? Right now, I'm feeling that intellectual freedom assumes that we live in a rational world where people can hold different ideas and be respectful. And if anybody is watching the news or reading the news, I'm not sure where we are on that right now. And we need to really think very carefully about ideas that may advocate violence against traumatized groups and have them given the protection of individual intellectual freedom. It's really, really a hard balancing act. And as Nick said, if having these discourses in your library is more painful and you need to protect your staff, have the meeting rooms used only for library-sponsored programs. If you decide not to do that, you may want to think about Well, if there's a group working in meeting in the meeting room that's not library sponsored, what can the library do to protect staff, protect vulnerable, marginalized people, and what other ways can you show support? Intellectual freedom, as we said, can exist only where two essential conditions are met. We started that at the beginning. Individuals have the right to hold any belief on any subject and to convey their ideas in any form they deem appropriate. And second, society makes an equal commitment to the right of unrestricted access to information and ideas, regardless of the communication medium used, the content of work, and the viewpoints of both the author and the receiver of information. And for years and years and decades, libraries was the place where people could learn and get access to ideas and to read about things on both sides. It was trying to have what I'm not sure can be a balanced collection. The Bill of Rights, the ALA Library Bill of Rights, and its interpretations declare a public library is content neutral, accessible to everyone, and open to all. I argue that this is something to strive towards, but it doesn't reflect current reality. Years ago, not too long ago, there were segregated libraries in our country. And today, if you look at our profession, it's predominantly white. We're starting to make strides, but we really need to continue in that direction to become more diverse. Are our libraries really open and accessible to everyone? I'd say no. I think it's a worthwhile goal, but challenges range from non-handicapped accessible buildings, and yes, throughout the state, there are way too many. The hours open, the location of where the libraries are, the languages and language support, budgets and budgeting issues, even the ability to get a library card. Do you need to have an address and mail in order to get a library card? Are you denying access to others? And the list goes on and on. I mean, you can look around and you can see it. And I'm not saying that this is intentional, but it's the state of libraries at this moment. So I'm going to argue that libraries have never been and are not now and should not be neutral organizations. We have our work cut out for us. I think, Nick, jump in anytime. I know you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, and you said it very well, and it reminded me of the title of this program. This program is not implementing, it's balancing. And so implementing would be easy. If I were to give this group, here's, the Library Bill of Rights and the interpretation, go ahead now, go on your way and go do it. That's just implementing it. But as Sarah pointed out, society gets in the way. We are not living in an equal society to be able to have equal rules. And so there are groups out there that very much, need to, that feel marginalized. And I'm not saying we have to treat, some groups differently than others. I'm saying your rules at your library need to understand that there are various levels in your community and what are you doing. So, to get a library card, I'm completely aware that many people, if I go into, libraries of a lot of people in this, on this call, and I say, and I'm asked for ID and I'm like, listen, I just don't have it. I have this temporary card or I don't have a permanent address. And some of you might deny me because of that. That's, you might even be able to give me good reasons. I'm going to take out material and you'll never see me again. So what do? So you have to find a way to be able to, address that particular issue. And that issue is one of a myriad that we all deal with all the time. And so, you have to find a way. We find a way in our library by telling the person that might be in temporary housing to please bring a letter from the place of temporary housing. Does that mean they're going to, and everybody, and so everybody who gets a new card in my library can only take out 5 items. That's it. No matter, how much address you show me or no address you show me, you get 5 items. You return them, and a month later, you're in good standing. I don't care if you have an address, you've proven that you're in good standing. And so we're going to make you, give you full ability to take out anything that you want. Are we going to get burned? Please, I get burned by people that have plenty of addresses, But, think about what the bottom line is. And if we really are dedicated to, again, implementing this balance and finding a balance, then we have to find the balance. Is it worth a few books, every once in a while to lose than to deny an entire class of people because they don't have an address? That's not a very good balance. I don't care. I'm going to get rid of those books after they circulate a few times anyway. So please, but what I am going to end up doing is denying people the right to use a library for years. And so that is not fair on the balance. So you might think it's like this, but in reality, it's like this. And that only comes from what? From talking to your community, from talking to the individuals, whether it's people in temporary housing or other marginalized societies, and actually communicating with them and dealing with these issues and having conversations so that you can implement, that you can find the balance and implement, intellectual freedom and access fairly.
Oh, Nick, do you want me to rev you up about access to broadband?
I would love to, because because I'm in a city doesn't mean that a large swath of the population that we serve has broadband either. So it's not just a rural, suburban, it's also an urban issue. So I would love to hear that.
We talk about service and access to facilities, including programs and technology. And broadband is one very, very clear and hot topic on the lack of access. It's so evident now due to the pandemic. If we could only have been a little bit more thoughtful and futuristic, we would have solved that too, but that's another story. Nick touched upon it. The library represents how a community spends its resources, and those decisions, again, are not neutral. And I would just say that your collection, to protect you and your collection, you need what Nick has been saying all along. You need a very, very clear policy of what's included in your collection, why you include it, and how you evaluate and weed your collection. And what needs to be in everyone's collection is a challenge policy. You'll lose in court if your policy, if somebody says, please remove the book, I don't like it, or remove the video. If you don't have a challenge procedure, you're going to lose in court. And again, that denies access to library resources because it will come out of your budget.
I would just add, Sarah, I would just add here that many of us really, I think it's easier to make that jump to have a balanced collection than to have balanced programming. Somehow it really comes alive when you're talking about programming, that, that it's right there, it's real. Whereas when it's on the shelf, it's like, oh, we have all points of views, on the shelf about many issues, death penalty. Let's just take that, for something that's just one of those, pro and cons that's been out there for a while. Everyone would think, of course we should have books on pro-death penalty and anti-death penalty. But the moment someone comes in to do a program that might be, you know, that might be, we shouldn't put your community's murderer to death, then it becomes very real.
Yeah, and I want to leave just two more thoughts out there, and then we'll be open to questions. We need to make sure our libraries are safe, responsible places and spaces for diverging opinions. We must acknowledge that the provision of access to the meeting rooms, for example, is not an endorsement of the hosts group's content, as well as having materials on the shelves isn't the library endorsing what is in the books and the information. We must offer access to service to all people in the community and sometimes beyond. And as we do, we must demonstrate respect for cultural expression and understanding. And I think it's our mission to offer new ideas and explore new ways of thought. That makes us vibrant. Anything to add, Nick?
I would just say, don't always look at people who are coming into your library. Think about people who are not coming into your library. We at Queens get very excited that we have 1 million people have a library card in Queens. When you hear that, you're like, oh my God, that's incredible. That's wonderful. Yay for us. And then you think, well, how many people live in Queens? 2.3 million? So you're saying half the people have a card, but half don't? Why not? Think of the people that are not represented in your library. You want to balance intellectual freedom. You want to balance access. You want to balance this. Look who's not using your library, and how do you bring them in to balance out the, you know, who is using your library, and why aren't they using your library?
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Sarah.
Becky, are there any questions?
Yeah.
I can't see them.
Yeah, so we had some questions pop up earlier, and then again, if you have questions right now, you can pop them into the chat, or you can start to raise your hand. There were a couple questions at the top, Nick, about a recommended code of conduct of policy, and if you would be willing to share yours.
Oh, if I want to share mine. What do you think mine's so good? That's very kind of you all. You know, in fact, in reading mine, I realized, you know, that it probably has to be updated because every policy should be looked at all the time. And that's always the challenge. I would have to, I'm a good warden of my position. I will check to make sure that, that I can share this. I would say this, there's a lot of good stuff out there too. And I know you're all librarians. I will check to see if I could share mine with the powers that be, but I am sure that there's really good codes of conduct policies. They're on the website. You know, a lot of places put them right on their website, what the code of conduct is. They might not be exhaustive. For example, ours is 2 pages long, our code of conduct. We probably put on the website, not this particular document. But, you know, there's good things out there. And the most important thing, you can make one yourself. The most important thing is, I'm not a lawyer. Some of you might be, okay? But I would go to a lawyer that knows what to look for when it comes to a code of conduct. But the most important thing about a code of conduct is implementing it fairly, okay? That's the thing. You can't let one group, you know, do something on your code of conduct that's against the code, but let other people do. So be aware that you know, can have it, but you actually have to, you know, use it fairly as well. But I will check on mine. Also, like I said, it's on the website. I believe it's on the website. I'll have to check. But there are others out there, is my point.
If the person who posted the question sends me an email to sdallas@sals.edu, I have some links and some tools that you can look at your policy to make sure it's language neutral and touches upon what needs to be touches upon. But Nick does make a good point. It should be reviewed by an attorney as well.
Great, thank you. And we've had a lot in the chat about Selena from Queens is asking, what do you think about how to reach out to the community who do not have library cards? And there's been lots of questions in the chat about getting people library cards and requirements for library cards and how to approach underserved communities getting them library cards. Can you address that?
Sarah, you want to take that? I can always speak to Selena on my day job. So, and not that I'm avoiding you, Selena.
You need to look at your policies. You need to think about what the role the library is in. Just because you want to make it accessible doesn't mean that everybody wants to take advantage of it. You have to be working with your community groups and partners who have inroads with some homeless populations, work with shelters. What I would think best is to work with your community groups and partners to make sure people have the choice to get the library card or not.
I would only add that one of the biggest problems with a card and using it is that we charge fines and fees, and ultimately that is a distraction for people It's actually an impediment for using your card, because you lose that one book, you can't pay for it. There's a whole nother discussion. I'm sure there's some program on that today as well that we won't go into, but that is a major reason why some people do not have a library card, is because of their fear of owing the library money and not being able to use their card, or the fear of being shamed, whether implicit or not, and not being able to pay it. And so I very much, my library is not fine free. It is a goal of ours, but I very much admire those of you who have gone fine free.
We have a question. Do you have a policy about refusing or not awards or honors from groups that are legacy-based or exclusive?
That's a good question.
That's what I thought.
That's a good question. And so if I'm saying that, clearly my answer is going to be, I don't know if I'm saying that. That's a good question. Very few legacy people have ever wanted to give us an award, so I'm not really sure about that. That's a good question, and I can definitely make note of that, but I'm pretty sure that we don't have a policy for it. We do have a policy for awards, but
And gifts.
And gifts, yeah, and gifts, and that usually goes to a foundation, which is our foundation, which actually has separate rules than the actual library itself, which our library is a not-for-profit organization, but a foundation can collect money. So there are varying rules and policies accordingly.
We don't get awards, so it hasn't come across my desk, except from Nyla.
More awards. What thoughts about how to balance patrons who are respectful and those who are disruptive? We've had to call the police because of unruly teens.
Oh, unruly teenagers, my favorites. Let me tell you, I've been doing this library thing for a little bit now. My previous job, before I did this, previous jobs a few times ago, was I was the coordinator for young adult services. And my job was to remind people about, giving your best service to teenagers. And so I think I would rather say, so your policy has to be about unruly customers or patrons, not about their age. That is critical to make the difference. It doesn't matter what someone looks like. What you are trying to monitor in your code of conduct is behavior, not how old somebody is. So if you have people that are, eating, drinking, littering, sleeping, loitering, it doesn't matter how old they are, they might be violating your code of conduct. If they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, if they're running around the library, making it difficult for other people to use. I have more problems with drunk adults than I do with teenagers. Okay, and so again, I don't care who they are. I care, are they infringing on the rights of other people to use the library? That's the problem that they have in the code, and that's what has to be addressed.
And look at the language. And what is unruly teenagers? And you made a good point, it's unruly people. But unruly people, it's if your policy is very subjective, then it's under the interpretation of who's ever the authority in the room. And one's disruptive is another's jubilant.
And it doesn't even have to be, for malicious intent. I remember being a branch manager, some of the loudest people in the library were some of those adults that, really probably could have used a hearing aid and they really didn't want to go down that road. Okay, and they were the loudest people in that library. So as a manager, I was always at any given point, who is being the loudest in my library? And I will address that right now. And oftentimes it was not necessarily the teenager.
Was it the staff?
The staff is so loud. I was loud.
No, really?
I think we have time for one more question. This was from earlier in the chat. Do you think the virtual world has affected ethical issues? And if so, how do we respond?
Would you repeat that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think the virtual world has affected ethical issues? And if so, how do we respond?
We've never done more virtual programming at the library than we have in the last 7 months. It's been really incredible. That doesn't mean that our public conduct policy doesn't change. So while now everyone can eat, drink, smoke, and sleep during our programs because they're in their own house, what they can't do is go online, whether it's through our website or a program, and be threatening towards a presenter. And what they can't do is they can't use obscene language. If they couldn't use it in the library, they can't use it virtually either. And so you cannot intimidate people, online. So the same rules really should be as effective, but you might want to have specific rules for an online environment.
I would have gone with this, that the access to the virtual programs, again, going back to the broadband, and that it's unethical to almost have it because so many people are denied. In fact, many people are denied computer access when the buildings were shut down, except if they had Wi-Fi, and that assumes that they had a device that they could access.
And then going back to the previous question about unruly and all of that, there was a follow-up question. Would you say the same applies for the behavior of individuals with a mental disability?
I think a lot of it has to do with, I'm giving you some time to think about it, Nick. I think a lot of it has to do with how well your staff is trained to de-escalate issues. And sometimes that is the difference between an incident and not. And training and being able to identify potential flare-ups, I think, is key.
Yeah. In the end, if someone's being allowed in the library and really, in violating your public conduct policy, and they're really being loud, no matter what it is, it has to be attended to. If someone is being loud because they cannot control themselves, but they want to be in the library, that's a little bit different to me than, someone who is intentionally being loud just for the sake of being loud. And they can't control themselves. Like I said, in the end, we still have to think about everybody else who's using the library, okay? But the fact that you have somebody, that might need more attention in the library is your opportunity to figure out, how do I serve this community and what are their needs in the library? And if their needs, if you start thinking about it, wait, what do I do when an autistic child needs attention? Do I kick them out of the library because they're being loud? Or, like I've seen in some libraries, do I have a quiet space in the corner in order to make them feel more comfortable in the library and help their caregiver in the library, so that the library is not a place where I might get kicked out, but the library is a safe space. So while the policy is still the same, while your code, how you're reacting to it is in this case, just like the title of this program, is where is that balance for people in your community that may need extra attention or may feel marginalized being in your library.
And one last question, I think just enough time. I feel like we could have a lot. This could be a double length session with just questions. Let's see, where did it go? What can a public library do about people loitering on our property outdoors? Do they have the right to be there because it's a public library? And then an asterisk, public library on school property.
I don't control the sidewalk. And I don't control the sidewalk. If people are loitering on the sidewalk, I can't control that. This is city property. What we can do is we can get help from, your local authorities, the city, to make sure that the access to your library is open. So certainly if a lot of people are loitering outside and people actually can't physically get into the building, that's a problem. And so I've certainly myself have said, listen, let's make sure everyone can come in. But in some cases, one has to know where one's authority begins and where it ends. In a case where mine would end, but I still have a problem, again, this is where your friends come in before a situation. You have relationships with your, local authorities, local office holders. People can help you. But again, my first thought would be, I'm glad that you're here around the library. What can we do for you to bring you in? And, so I understand that it might seem, and one group might seem more threatening than another group. And, that may be just perception and maybe not reality. But the fact is that they're so close to the library is an opportunity to do something, with the community that's clearly, it's a great opportunity. They came to you. What can you do for them? I would try to turn it into a positive. I would say that is really hard. So if I made that sound easy, I am sorry, okay? Because that is not easy. That is a challenge. Okay, but it's a good challenge because the results, positive results would be fantastic, but it is not easy. None of this stuff that we talked about is easy. And some of it actually has real ramifications if you do it wrong.
On that note, thank you both so much for having these not easy conversations, right? And bringing these topics. I think that's kind of the first hurdle with all of this, is having these discussions. So thank you so much. Again, this will be recorded. We will share it out when it's ready. You're getting so many thank yous, so many great presentations. Selena said, great job, Chief. So thank you so much, everyone. For everyone still here, if you're looking for something to do from 4:30 to 5, you can search social hour in the program description, or look for social hour, and there are 5 different social hour things you can kind of go to that are being sponsored by some NYLA members. Jeremy and I are each hosting one if you want to just kind of hang out and relax or play some games and stuff like that. So you can check those out. Otherwise, our first session starts tomorrow morning bright and early at 8 a.m. So you can just kind of, roll out of bed and grab your coffee. Thank you again so much, Nick and Sarah. What a wonderful session. Great conversation. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you, Nyla. Thank you,
Thanks.
Intellectual Freedom. Thank you, Sarah.